Ho il compito gradito di svolgere
to
il
be
ruolo di
moderator
moderatore
of
di
this
questa
session,
sessione, moderatore della
moderator
tavola
of the
rotonda.
round table.
Adesso
Is
quindi la
not just a
sessione anche
session if
conclude
it will
questa
conclude
prima
this
giornata
first
di
day of
lavori.
work.
Di
So
nuovo
good evening.
buonasera,
Thank you
grazie
for
per la
your
vostra
presence here
presenza
on
e
the
a nome
name
del
of the
Comitato
Scientific
Scientifico di cui
Committee
faccio
I belong
parte.
to.
Sono davvero
I'm very
ben
happy
felice di aver
to have
constatato
seen
che
that
questa
this
prima
first day
giornata
has
è
been
stata
really
davvero densa,
full of work, very
interessante,
interesting,
stimolante,
challenging,
sentendo anche
also
qualche voce delle
listening to the
varie sezioni
different voices
linguistiche.
from the
Adesso, come
linguistic
sapete,
sections. Now,
i
as you know, the
moderatori sono
moderator
pregati di
are
venire qui
kindly
al tavolo
asked to come
della
here.
presidenza. I
The
moderatori delle varie
moderators of the
sezioni
different
linguistiche.
linguistic
I moderatori
sections,
hanno a
moderators
disposizione
have 10
10
minutes
minuti,
each.
ognuno di loro farà una
Each of them
relazione
will have a
sintetica
very
sui molti
synthetic
punti che le
report on
relazioni e
the
le
different
comunicazioni
hints that the
hanno dato,
communications
quindi
have
4 per
offered.
10 fa
So
40, no?
4
Poi
for 10 is 40. Then we have
rimangono
20
20
minutes
minuti per
for
il
dialogue.
dialogo. Il dialogo aperto anche, per esempio, al
That is
professor Pitta, che
open
ha
also
parlato
to Professor
questa
Pitta,
mattina, e
and
dialogo
of
con cui
course
abbiamo
it's
aperto
open
con
with the
i moderatori.
moderators.
Per
As
quanto
to
riguarda il
the
dialogo, lo
dialogue,
dico fin da
I
adesso, domande
want
molto
to
brevi, al massimo
precise very
2
short
minuti per una
questions,
domanda,
just
non
2
di più.
minutes.
Se
If
1
it is
minuto e
less,
mezzo è
even
meglio.
better.
Domande sintetiche e
Synthetic
puntuali,
and accurate
in
questions,
modo
so
da dare
to give time
tempo
to
ai professori
professors
interpellati di
to answer.
rispondere. Faremo 3 domande,
We
gruppi
shall
di
have a
3
group of
domande,
3 questions, the
prime 3
first
e poi
3,
se ce ne
and
saranno
after, if
altre,
there will
ci
be others.
regoliamo in questo modo. La
The
tematica
theme
che è
that has
stata
been
trattata
treated so far
quest'oggi è la
is
tematica che
the
ha
theme that has
avviato il
started
congresso
the
anche sulla
Congress
base
on the
degli
base
interventi
of
di
the
questa
lectures
mattina
of
e
this
della
morning and
professione
of
del superiore
the opening
generale.
of the General Superior.
La
The theme,
tematica, come
as
ben
you know,
sappiamo, e riprendiamo in mano i
and we
testi,
shall
la
take
tematica,
the text,
la sapienza
the
della
wisdom
croce
of
e
cross
le
and the
sfide
challenges of
delle
cultures.
culture. Le sezioni
The
linguistiche,
linguistic
oltretutto,
sections
hanno
have
raccolto
gathered
diverse
different
sfide.
challenges, I could say.
Come ha
Well,
detto
as
Padre
Father
Taccone
Taccone
nella
said in his lecture,
presentazione
which has
precisa,
been
chiara del
precise
congresso,
of the Congress,
negli altri
during
congressi, negli
in
altri
the
3
other 3
congressi, le
congresses, the
sfide
challenges that
poste
have been put by
dalle
the culture,
culture,
by
dalle
questions
domande
that
che il mondo
the
crescente
world
pone al
asks
mistero
to the
della
mystery of the
croce,
cross.
ci sono
Well,
sempre
they have
state e ci
basically
saranno,
been
ma
and they will
con
exist,
questo
but by
congresso
this
ci
Congress
rendiamo
we do
conto che ci
realize that
sono
there are
sfide
new
inedite, nuove,
challenges
cioè
as
rispetto
to
a
the
quelle
ones
poste nei
that we
decenni
had in the
passati.
past years.
E
Of course,
chiaramente un
a
congresso
Congress
non
does not
ripete
repeat what
quello
has
che è
been
stato detto negli
said
altri
in the other
congressi,
Congresses,
ma
but opens
apre
new
piste
ways,
nuove, piste
new
nuove
ways
per le
for the
risposte
answers to
a
so many
tante domande
questions
e
and
sfide
challenges,
inedite, perché
and
il
new
mondo va
challenges
avanti,
because the world goes on
lo
and we know
sappiamo
it very
bene.
well.
Oggi si
Today,
è detto non sono dei semplici
we said
cambiamenti
that we don't have
epocali,
just
ma è
symbol
proprio
epochal changes, but it's all
un'epoca
an
che
era
sta
that is
cambiando,
changing, and we
e lo
know it
sappiamo
very
bene,
well.
non devo
I
menzionare
don't need
altri
stressing
se no.
it. So
Grazie
thank
per
you
la
for your
vostra
presence.
presenza,
Thank you
grazie
to
ai
the
moderatori fin
moderators.
d'ora.
We start
Cominciamo allora dal
from
professor Giuseppe Marco
Professor
Salvati,
Marco Salvati
della Pontificia Università di San
of
Tommaso, il quale ha svolto il
Pontificia
compito di
University
moderatore
of
della
San
sezione
Tommaso that
linguistica
has been
italiana.
the moderator of the Italian section. Thank you, Professor Battaglia. Good evening to all of you. Our task, our group was questioning how the others about the wisdom of the cross as a provoking challenge in the modern Areopagus, the cultural one. We had the first lecture by Professor Assolan, who was suggesting but inspiring us to the cross, which is a very clear place where we can catch the style of the acting of God. We can learn the radicality of the gift. From the cross we do learn, Professor Assolani says, the gratuity channel that can be something that is defining the same nature of God. Is the Father that is communicating the life to the Son, and with the Son it gives to the Spirit. And we know that the three communicate by giving the existence to creature and giving themselves until the death, and the death on the cross of the Son that was made of flesh. This is the fundamental, the core of the pastoral action. This is the real matrix that is generating the will to share the questions and the crosses of the history and of man. The cross is also a kind of measure, a criteria for criticism, discernment, criticism that is hidden or clear, and also of permanent conversion of the ecclesiastic community. Professor Link, he has been talking about the cross that can be source of unity into a world that is fragmented, into a church that is divided. So he took the example, the one of the church, the origin of Ephesus. In this community, it was underlined, we can catch the complexity of history and of histories of people that are part of the community, just as we can perceive very well from the papers the fatigue, the work to put all together the social differences, the cultural differences, and also the religious sensitiveness, which are different. Well, in this situation, the cross and Christ become just a paradigm for unity and the strength that is supported the commitment, so to build this unity. Professor Greva has been talking about Justin and about his way to come to the research of the truth, the attempt to conciliate Jerusalem. So, Justin wants to valorize what is true in each man. Well, all that has been for him something to consider with optimism the research of the truth and the humankind. It allowed to Justin not to oppose Athens to Jerusalem, but he showed how Athens can be propedeutical to Jerusalem, and could be also, and it has be the occasion to better understand Jerusalem, the presence of God into the history and the revelation. Well, all that without stopping to think that Jerusalem is light, just as the faith is a light for the reason. Well, we could say that the Christian identity is not opposed, does not oppose, but favor the differences. And there is a kind of conciliation. The Christian identity does not suppress the engagement for the comparison. We could also say that it was not the commitment of Justin designed to build up walls, but to build bridges. So the Christian identity does not create polemics, but a dialogue. Does not want to make problems, but it arouses humbleness, openness, attention. And in this framework, Professor Greva said the role is an apical role in the sense that it offers the apex of the knowledge of the divine, the apex of the presence of the Logos that has been incarnated. So man continues to find into the cross the truth. But attention, not only the truth that makes peaceful the intelligent, but the truth that is giving happiness and Savior. Professor Di Stefano has considered the case of St. Paul of the Cross and the concept of freedom that St. Paul was able to live and then communicate starting from the cross of Christ. The cross is something that creates freedom. This has been taught by the experience of St. Paul of the Cross. To the school of the crucifix, St. Paul of the Cross learned the art of giving himself, the art of being taken by God, to be transformed by love of God and to become a subject of love. Even here, I think we can say it is not difficult to see into this experience an important communication of sensitiveness as it is our, especially in the Western world, in which we think that freedom has just one privatistic dimension or selfish dimension. Who is a free man, serious free? From the cross of Christ, we have an answer that is really a scandal, something incredible. Well, it is the one who can lose himself for land, the one that can build and not destroy. So in the last lecture by Professor Buioni in the Italian section, we've been referred how to inspiring to the cross of Christ we can become people that, as it has been written, Simone Weil, so people that lie on the threshold. He has been used this expression in a real and concrete way. So the deployment of himself becomes welcoming of God's love. That is the threshold. Or it becomes a waiting for his love, the love of God. But altogether, to be on the threshold, as taught Simone Weil, means to be with the far people, with the last people. And in his experience of life, he had this need. So, if you are on the threshold, you are with the far away, with those that are far from the space of safety, that are far from the space of belonging to something that makes you be peacefully. So the cross, I can conclude by what Professor Buioni taught, starting from the experience of Simone Weil, does not make peaceful, but does the contrary, does not diminish, but it increases the desire. So we could say that making the believers a people that lives, that goes on, lives into the solidarity and that is committed in building up the peace. Thank you.
Grazie.
Thank to Professor
Ora
Salvati.
passiamo
Now
alla
we
relazione
have
sulla sessione
the
inglese. Il
English
moderatore è il dottor Paul Francis
the
Spencer.
English session, Paul Francis Spencer.
Good afternoon. In the English-speaking section, our first speaker was unfortunately unable to be with us, and that was Professor Alla Opastanelli, who was unable to be here, unfortunately. He regretted that, but he sent his text, and he was speaking on the cross in relation to ecclesiology. So he looked at the different fields of the theology of the cross, soteriology, epistemology, and anthropology. And then he wished to develop the notion of ecclesiology in relation to the cross, leaning on the document of 2013 from the World Council of Churches, the Church Towards a Common Vision. And in this reflection, some of the striking things, one was where he talked about the mystery of the cross leading us to acceptance of paradox, and this in the field of ecumenical dialogue, that an awareness of the cross can bring us to a deeper acceptance of the paradox that exists in our separated communities. And the brokenness of the cross can bring us to a deeper love for the brokenness of the church and the brokenness within ourselves. And in his conclusion, he said, perhaps under the cross, our differences lose their power of separation, so that there is a real opportunity in the ecclesiological discourse to bring the cross as a power which eliminates separation, which sees paradox as an opportunity, and which brings people together under the cross, a sign of God's love. And he gave the example of Mary and John at the foot of the cross, the first community formed by Christ on Calvary, and how in our work of working together as churches, as ecclesial communities, we draw strength from that. Our second speaker was Father Thomas Joseph White, who is the Retore Magnifico, the rector of the Pontifical Angelicum University. And he spoke on one flesh for the life of the world, with the question, how can a singular human death redeem all of humanity? So here he spoke of the uniqueness of the death of Christ, the scandalous particularity, the scandalous singularity of the incarnation, death, and resurrection of Jesus, which touches the theology of God, of salvation, and hope in the face of evil. So God's interaction in history, he said, through the incarnation, through the passion and death of Jesus, through his resurrection, answers the promise of evil, is God's response to the question of evil in that singular event of the incarnation, death, and resurrection of Jesus, his Son. Professor Donna Orsuto from the Gregorian University, who is well known to the Passionists through the Lay Center at St. John Paul's, shared with us a reflection on a sermon of John Henry Newman with the title, Let Us Begin with Christ, Let Us Begin with His Cross, the centrality of Christ crucified in the writings of St. John Henry Newman. And this was Newman's Anglican sermon preached on Good Friday, 1841, when he was the Anglican vicar of the University Church of St. Mary's in Oxford. She was able to put the sermon into context, asking what was happening in his life at that time. He had just turned 40 years of age, was feeling old, getting a sense of being old at 40, if you can remember that far back, some of us. It was also in the time when he was in conflict with the Anglican Church over the publication of Tract 90. Now, Tract 90 was his attempt to reconcile Catholic doctrine with the articles, the 39 articles of the Church of England. And for this, he came into conflict with his bishop and with other authorities. And it's in this context that he writes this sermon preached on Good Friday in 1841. But in this sermon, which is a true pastoral sermon, Newman insists that we look at the cross. That collection of sermons from that period of his life was published under the title Parochial and Plain Sermons. And you can see that as well as a theologian, he is writing here as a pastor. He offers the cross as a challenge to false ideas of what is of value in the world, as a remedy to suffering, to conflict, to difficulties that we face, and as a focus for our contemplation. And the speaker suggested that in the context of this Congress, Newman's words are relevant. How do I live effectively in this world? I do so by contemplating the cross. Our next speaker was Professor Shahid Mobin from the Urbaniana University, who spoke on the wisdom of Scientia Crucis in the writings of Edith Stein. So this is Edith Stein's book, Wisdom of the Cross, which is a reflection on the cross in the writings of St. John of the Cross. And her thought, of course, was already rooted in the anthropology of Husserl, through her work with Husserl, her work in phenomenology. But here she looks at John of the Cross and his understanding of how God works in the human person and how God does so through the cross. Now, the book was written when she was in the Netherlands, in that period in her life when she had already been exiled from Germany because of the rise of Nazism, and she went as a refugee to a Carmel in the Netherlands and was there before she went to Auschwitz. So it's in that transitional period of her life that she is writing about the cross. And here she talks about purity of heart, the purity of an adult being different from that of a child, and how we come to serenity of heart and mind through purification, which brings about transformation. And there the soul finds a resting place in God, but can always penetrate more deeply into God. And what moves the soul is love, moving her to the heights of God. And union takes place in the deepest ground of the soul. So there we are in the heights of God and the deepest ground of the soul. But I remembered a little word of Albertus Magnus where he says that in this spiritual context, of course, height and depth are interchangeable. And our final speaker was Professor Father James Mora, who is from Kenya and who is at the Pontifical University of the Holy Cross and has a background in Scripture. And his theme was the daily cross, an apostolic magnet. In other words, the cross as something which draws and attracts people to Christ. And he's reflected on how the cross began in that time as something repulsive, but ended up as something different. And so in the New Testament, missionaries are called to preach the cross, to present the message of Christ crucified and risen. And St. Paul himself preaches Christ crucified as a way of drawing people to faith. However, he said the cross draws people to faith not just through the story, but also through the lived reality of Christians. So as Christians, we are called to take up our cross every day. And this example of living as people who take up the cross draws others to faith. Now, all of these reflections were related, of course, to the theme of the day, the wisdom of the cross as a factor of provocation and challenge in today's cultural setting. But in our particular group, I think one of the things which was evident was the challenge of dialogue with other Christians and with those of other religions. And of course, we're living now in the context of Pope Francis's text, Tutti Fratelli, where we're all called to live that spirit of fraternity. But as Passionists, it's a reminder of our own heritage. And Professor Tracy Rowland this morning, in her talk given from Sydney, spoke about Dominic Barbary, Ignatius Spencer, and John Henry Newman, and their role in bringing together a divided Christianity. I think of Ignatius Spencer, whose life was spent in promoting prayer for unity, and who here in Rome had to, I won't say fight with the Pope, but he had to struggle to have that expression, separated brethren, used as a way of speaking of Christians of other communities. And it reminds me of a little thing in my own life, my own family. My own family name is also Spencer. And of course, it's an Anglican name. It's not a Catholic family. And I remember a few years ago looking back records from where my family are from, back over 100 years, because I knew that my great-grandfather had been an Anglican, had married a Catholic, and then the children were baptized as Catholic. And I found my great-grandfather's baptism record all written in Latin. And it had Nomen Matris, Maria Flynn, Nomen Patris, Henricus Spencer, and then in brackets after his name was written by the parish priest, Hereticus. We've come a long way from that. So we thank God for the grace of being brothers and sisters together in the Christian community and being able to work for dialogue. Thank you.
Grazie, dottor Paul Francis Spencer, per la sua sintesi. Passiamo
Brief presentation. We would like to give the floor to Professor
per la sezione linguistica.
Luis Quintero for the linguistic section.
Dentro de las relaciones que deberían presentarse en la sección de habla española, por ponerles una característica que nos puede orientar. La primera, que por cierto era del profesor Carlos María Gali, que no ha participado, y únicamente nos ha llegado el esquema de lo que supongo que enviará para las actas del Congreso. Y por ponerle una característica, podríamos decir que lo que nos ha ofrecido, o lo que va a ofrecer el padre Carlos María Gali, presbítero de la Iglesia Argentina, podríamos encabezarla con el título de una reflexión sobre la sabiduría de la cruz pascual en las cruces de la sociedad actual, a mi juicio con una insistencia de la reflexión teológica latinoamericana. Los apartados que proponía, la lectura teologal de los signos de la cultura contemporánea, las cruces de las personas y los pueblos en tiempos de pandemia, Jesucristo, Dios crucificado y hombre resucitado, Sapiencia Moris, la sabiduría evangélica del amor de donación, Sapiencia Crucis, la lógica sapiencial de la cruz pascual, el pueblo de Dios, servidor sufriente entre los crucificados de la historia, el pueblo de Dios, buen samaritano compasivo de toda miseria humana, la mirada de María, Madre de la Misericordia desde América Latina. Esta era su presentación y supongo que formará parte de las actas del Congreso. El resto de las aportaciones, por ponerlas también una característica que a lo mejor nos ayuda para situarlas, podríamos decir una reflexión, en primer lugar, de lo que llamaríamos de teología sistemática o teología dogmática, la del profesor Philippe Goiret, de la Universidad Santa Cruz de Roma, y él se hacía estas preguntas. ¿Puede todavía un hombre formado en la civilización occidental contemporánea creer en la divinidad de Jesucristo, Hijo de Dios? ¿Puede este hombre mirar un crucifijo y reconocer en Jesús al Verbo encarnado que sufre la muerte por nuestros pecados? ¿Es la cruz fuente de nuestra fe o es más bien un obstáculo que nos aleja de ella? Bien, pues su reflexión de teología sistemática
Systematic reflection is framed the faith and the cross in this reality of pain, of the pain and the silence. So to make a systematic theology that would represent a forma mentis, but of course that would be linked to the cross, with a wish to obtain which are the consequences of the process of Savior. They were talking about the darkness that is not just dark in itself, but it represents the way that brings to the light. It's the pain of the dark. And he insisted about some a quotation of Pope Francis, because he talks about a faith that does not put into Christ it is not talk about the experience that talks of the darkness. It's not something that will save us. At the same way, he was putting in evidence how all that represents a reality that comes with us, and to suffer any pain, this is a way of faith. Well, God calls us in our pain, and from this experience of pain, he leads us towards the being saved. Dr. Fleng, with the logotherapy techniques, well, he made it a doctrine in the German camps, and he was asking if it was not sufficient the reason why God was becoming man, and why we have to consider that to insert it into a theology. But we don't talk about the Father that is crossed, but is the Son that gives love of the Father to mankind by making himself a creature. And this was referring to the reality of the faith, this evil that is doubting the creation and the destiny upon the human being. So it also considers how it is important, the providence of love that is supporting the human history. And also the mystery of cross will reveal the love of God Father, and the Paschal mystery comes towards us by making us new creature. We could talk about a systematic theology. The second relation has been by Mr. Oviedo from Antoniana University. He was referring to the fact that in this last part of this research is concentrated about the study of research being empiric, and he tries to describe or to face the key of the religion from the empirical point of view, by starting from the reality, the study of what have been the actions as to the reality of the religion, or what are the proposals from salvation. Well, he was saying that inside the credibility of the faith, the reason why we believe, we have to introduce a dimension that can be more understandable, and this will lead us to an authentic dimension by also recalling that the Christian announcement, the announcement of the cross of Jesus Christ, it's something concerning a happy life, and this therapeutical rationality should be included into our mind. So as to the credibility of faith, we must try the situations in which the announcement of the cross is just as a tree that can cure, and to try the real quality of the human life. Well, I think this can be a summary of what are the elements that have been introduced. Third, Martina and Gonzalez is Carmelita, and he's been talking about the research of God in himself, and to try to find God, this mechanism of the spiritual life. In the 7th chapter of the second book of Mondo Carmelo Word, the fundamental is that the dark night is something that is documented in the Carmelo Mount. It's a kind of conversion that has got the discovery of a higher love. And all the process of purification, all the process to deveil, it's something that tends to receive the gift of love and life from God. So we have to welcome, to get all what God gives us. So it's not a conquest, but it's just to be open to all that. It's a path that allows to come out from ourselves. In this sense, it's purification of the person. This is the criteria of each step. Purification of the way of faith, which is authentic in the way we follow Jesus Christ. So it's something by which we put the cross on ourselves, the life, the tree of life. This was referred in the chapter 7 and the book 22, in which St. Paul of the Cross was considering the letters. So in this way of purification, we see a way of love towards the fullness of love. In the end, from the biblical point of view, the contribution of Tarcisio Gaitan that could not be here, but he sent his communication. He is making an analysis of the Apocalypse and of the lamb that has been killed. And he talks of the community, the Christian community, the community that is in the Apocalypse, a community that must find a space in fighting the beast as to the research of his way of living. And here we talk about the lamb that has been killed and represents something that is risen again. So this is the representation of those who have washed their clothes into the blood of the Lamb.
Grazie. Professor
Now we pass to the last session, the French language. Professor Patrick Valdemy, Prorector of la Pontifice Lateran University. I hand you the word.
Bonsoir à tous. Donc, je vais utiliser ma langue.
Buonasera a tutti, posso utilizzare la mia lingua per fare una specie
bref du travail qui a été fait cet après-midi avec les personnes qui ont proposé des interventions en français. La première était consacrée au thème de l'avenir du christianisme dans un monde globalisé. Et ça a été l'occasion pour le conférencier d'évoquer la figure d'un passionniste que le père Taccone a cité ce matin, le père Stanislas Breton, que j'ai eu la chance de connaître quand j'étais recteur de l'Institut catholique. Un passionniste, un passionné et passionnant. Passionné parce que nous l'avons, ceux qui l'ont connu, je vois que des personnes manifestent leur adhésion à ce que je dis. Effectivement, c'est quelqu'un qui avait une vitalité physique et intellectuelle extraordinaire, qui tirait les personnes vers le haut. Et on lui doit beaucoup en France parce que c'est quelqu'un qui était très identifié, et l'intervenant l'a bien montré, très identifié du point de vue de son adhésion au christianisme. C'était un chrétien et qui existait dans le monde des philosophes et qui a été reçu dans le monde de la philosophie parce que sa foi n'a pas été un instrument, si j'ose dire, un moyen de séparation. Au contraire, ça a été un instrument qui l'a rendu très proche de tous ceux qui, comme lui, réfléchissaient sur les structures fondamentales de l'être humain en termes philosophiques, y compris des gens qui n'avaient pas la foi. Son meilleur ami était Althusser. Et l'intervenant de cet après-midi a bien montré que, à la fois dans sa vision philosophique et dans la vision qu'il retirait de sa foi, il y a deux mots-clés, en quelque sorte, qui sont apparus. Le premier est celui de liberté, et le second est celui de relation. Et c'est là où, à titre personnel, celui qui rend compte d'un travail donne ses sentiments. Peut-être c'est la première fois que je me suis aperçu que sa foi vécue dans la congrégation passionniste, sa foi vécue comme passionniste, est une des clés pour comprendre Stanislas Breton. L'intervenant a évoqué la rencontre des disciples avec Jésus. Où habites-tu? Où habites-tu? Et Stanislas Breton a répondu à cette question: le chrétien, et ça c'est l'avenir du christianisme, le chrétien doit habiter au pied de la croix. En habitant au pied de la croix, il sera un témoin de la liberté, car c'est là que Dieu se donne. Don, abandon, pardon. Et ce sont les éléments de fond d'une relation. La deuxième intervention était à caractère de théologie morale. L'intervenant a recherché quelles étaient les implications morales de la passion du Christ dans le monde d'aujourd'hui. Et il a tiré quatre réflexions, 4 points essentiels. Trois points. Le premier point est, comme implication morale, c'est le don de soi à la suite du Christ. Et le chrétien est appelé à rentrer dans la logique du don, qui est celle de l'amour. Vivre, c'est donner. La deuxième est, implication morale, le devoir de l'éducation à la liberté. On retrouve d'ailleurs, étonnamment, puisque l'intervenant était passionniste, cet élément qu'on a trouvé chez Breton de liberté. Sans doute, dans la spiritualité des passionnistes, il y a ce terme qui est assez fondamental. L'éducation à la liberté, éducation à la vie morale, orientée vers l'amour. Et la troisième implication est l'éducation à la fidélité, à la miséricorde, à la paix, à la sainteté, à la plénitude de la vie du Christ. La troisième intervention considérait le fait que nous vivons dans une société multiculturelle. L'intervenant a eu, grosso modo, 5 points. Le premier pour dire que une analyse de la culture, disant que nous avons tous une culture, et le chrétien vit dans cette culture. Et la culture, il l'a en quelque sorte définie comme quelque chose de commun entre les personnes qui sont très diverses. Nous avons diverses appartenances, mais il y a une partie commune, c'est la culture. Et nous vivons dedans. Il a cherché à trouver quelles étaient ce qu'il a appelé les valeurs existentielles qui viennent du fait que dans la spiritualité d'un chrétien, il y a la croix. Il en a donné 2, le courage et la justice. Pour le courage, il s'est servi de l'image de Pilate, l'anti-courage. Et la justice comme obéissance au Père. Ensuite, il a cherché quelles étaient les valeurs ontologiques de la croix, c'est-à-dire quels sont les éléments qui font partie vraiment de la structure, l'ontologie. Il y en a 2. Le fait de la rédemption, car le Fils de l'homme s'est immolé, la rédemption et la souffrance, le serviteur souffrant. La souffrance est une voie pour l'être, et ce n'est pas une chose dont il soit se départir. Enfin, il a cherché les effets de la culture de la croix. Il en a donné deux. L'engagement contre l'intolérance, le manque d'acceptation de l'autre, et l'engagement pour la paix, le pardon, la réconciliation. En fait, on sent que dans les interventions, il y a des mots-clés que l'on retrouve un peu partout, car ce sont des éléments qui sont puisés dans la spiritualité de la croix. La quatrième intervention nous a fait sortir de notre manière de parler jusqu'alors, et l'intervenant a analysé des lettres d'échange entre Monseigneur Gay et une religieuse, Marie-Thérèse Emmanuel, ou Mère Thérèse Emmanuel, c'est pas Marie, Mère Thérèse Emmanuel. Nous sommes au XIXe siècle en France, à l'époque du romantisme, et il y a une correspondance entre eux et qui est intéressante parce que Monseigneur Gay évoque le mystère de la croix dans ses relations spirituelles avec cette religieuse. Mais il relie le mystère de la croix au mystère de la naissance du Christ. Il relie la croix et Bethléem avec cette phrase clé: aller au calvaire par Bethléem et à Bethléem par la croix. Donc, l'intervenant nous a en quelque sorte fait rentrer dans cette correspondance où la personne a cru, du verbe croître, spirituellement, pour ne pas s'être enfermé dans une spiritualité de la croix qui aurait pu être doloriste à une période du romantisme français, pour lui donner une extension, pour bien faire comprendre qu'il s'agissait, avec la croix, du mystère de l'incarnation. Et enfin, la dernière conférence parlait du cœur transpercé de Jésus. Et le cœur transpercé a une importance, une valeur spirituelle, du fait que, comme Saint Jean l'a rapporté dans l'Évangile, il s'agit d'un fait historique. Du cœur, de la plaie de Jésus, sort du sang et de l'eau. Et ce fait historique est à la racine, alors qu'il est singulier, d'une universalité du christianisme et de l'amour. Pourquoi? Parce que dans ce cœur transpercé d'où coule le sang et l'eau, donc d'où vient le don de ce cœur transpercé, qui est celui du Christ, on passe au cœur du croyant, lequel doit être aussi d'où part le don du sang et de l'eau. Et donc, passant vers le cœur du croyant, du simple fait historique naît une universalité, unique et singulier. Et sans doute là, retrouvons-nous des thèmes qui ont été évoqués par les autres pour bien montrer que la spiritualité chrétienne, telle qu'elle a été évoquée, fondée sur la croix, est une spiritualité qui unit et qui ne sépare pas.
Ringraziamo professor Valdrini e tutti e quattro I moderatori perché stiamo...
Moderators, because we are keeping our times and we still have 15 minutes. We can have our questions. You can pose your questions till 6:30, and then we will have the moment of prayers according to our vademecum that can you see in front of us. We can have 3 questions, and then we will see how to proceed. Professor Pitta, if you would like to come over here. Is there anybody who would like to take the floor and speak? I have some lights in front of my eyes, so I cannot see very well. I need my glasses. Thank you to Father Tito. Well, can you introduce yourself? Introduce yourself and then pose your question. Thank you to the speakers. Thank you to those who could explain things briefly. The fact that we are good Christians, we manifest the tendency to see differences within a possible unit. But as good Christians, we should at the same time see the differences within a possible unit. And I'm referring to the words of St. John words, where he states that he said, I'm appreciating the good works, but I have something against you. And he was referring to Nicolaitans. There are in the Christian communities, the dialectical theologians, in particular Albert, they introduce the cross as the judgment on the scene of the humanity. So the difference is not something that coincides or that has to be conciled, but something that we should maintain. Well, good. If somebody else would like to pose his question. A question and an objection at the same time, and a request. Because of my research on the dimensions of freedom in the poles of the cross, he really have a great idea of his era of all his topics. He's really striking at the heart of the freedom. Namely, he grasped the power of mankind, of the whole mankind, as the power of the whole God, the power of the mankind because a donation of the mankind, and the power of God because it's a donation of the man. And this gift is within the mystery of the cross. So the supreme donation of God, upon which there is the original foundation. And for this reason, I really would exhort the presidency of the Jubilee and the director of the conference, together with their collaborators, to this holy siege, to the right authorities of the right siege, to name Paul of the Cross, Doctor Mystical of the Church. Bravo. Bravo. Very well. Other hands that are raised? Here with the third question. And then whoever the moderators would like to answer and take the floor and reply. Good evening, I'm Sandra. I'm a lay. Maybe I feel a bit of out of place, but I would like to pose this question. I'm referring to the presentation of Peter taking its own cross. As a passionist, for me, the cross, it's an act of love. So taking its cross means taking your poor loving capacity and go on. This morning I'll you gave me right, because this cross, my capability of loving, can be transformed and absorbed. I read it in this way. If it's not like this, please, I will label myself as heretic as well. I would like to give the floor to Padre Pitta, because he was the speaker of this morning, so he can reply, and then maybe we have other questions, and maybe other moderators can intervene.
I think that there is a relationship by which the different authors of New Testaments interpret the event of the cross. That of the path until the cross is a very important datum that must not be neglected. We also been talking when we thought about the disciple that had to be at the feet of the cross. But it is true, but I think that is also true, and this is something realism in the Testament, that at the foot of the cross of Christ there is no one. The synoptic do not put anyone. So he puts his cross. It is also true that we must realize of a gap also for the disciple as to the cross, and for John and the mother, but for synoptic there is no disciple. This makes us understand that it is true that say of Jesus, you take your cross and follow me, but with the realism of a vision of the cross, which is not sweetened, but is signed by the realism. And I think this is very important. So I thank you for your observation. Thank you. Some of the moderator wants to take the floor. Few minutes. Professor Salvati. I would like to come back on the question that talks about impossible novelty. We can refer it to different ideas. I want to say the need to have it at the bottom of the cross, to be united to the challenge, the weakness of the human being. If we want also to be exposed to the sin of the human being, is becoming for us so familiar. So it is familiar, the idea that it arises dialogue, will to meet, research of peace, research for communion. A religious is dealing about it, apart the theologist, Dominican. And many will match to the commitment of my order, the condemnation, the walls that have been built up, to the distinction that creates the splitting of people. It's not so. I think that the cross is teaching another style, which is not to accept the sin, but the capability to distinguish the sin for the people in trying to learn something, to the will to build up something. And I think that it is urgent to adopt as ecclesiastic community this sensitiveness, this perspective, this want, this hope. The cross tell us today in this century where we live? Well, thank you. Now we have the pray. I want to add just a short reflection. I am referring to some hints. The mystery of the cross, Jesus Christ, has such an importance of universal mediation that unifies. And I refer to the press conference in which the Cardinal Parolin said that the crucifix belongs to everyone. So it's something that refers to unity in perspective of the universal brotherhood, which is fundamental. So this was a thought. I want to thank all the speakers of this morning, to the speakers of the linguistic sections, and also to the speakers that made the communication, and thank to moderator for their clearness and precision in their exposition. I think that this first day has been very satisfying, but at 20:30 we have this meeting, cultural meeting, musical meeting at the St. John and Paul to listen to the choir of Monsignor Frisina. Now take the book, page 616, and we conclude with the prayer that has been proposed here, the evening prayer.
Preghiamo insieme. O Padre, tu hai tanto amato il mondo da dare il tuo Figlio unigenito e lo hai mandato nel mondo non perché il mondo fosse condannato, ma salvato per mezzo di Lui. La passione del tuo Figlio continua nel mondo, abbracciando i dolori e le sofferenze di ogni uomo. Era necessaria la morte del tuo Figlio perché non andasse in rovina l'umanità intera. Il mondo è plurale quando esso è sinfonia di lingue, etnie, culture, come Pentecoste dello Spirito, che parla tutte le lingue e si esprime in tutte le culture, trovandosi in esse disseminati i semi della verità del Verbo tuo Figlio. Questo è il prodigio del tuo Spirito, che fa del plurale l'unità nel rispetto e nella coltivazione delle distinzioni. Ma il mondo è plurale anche quando esso vuole di nuovo innalzare la torre di Babele, attentando globalmente al primato esclusivo di Dio sulla creazione, sulla natura, sulla terra, sull'uomo, con la conseguente progressiva eliminazione delle differenze e la distruzione della creazione. O Padre, nel sangue della croce del tuo Figlio sono state pacificate le cose che stanno nella terra e le cose che stanno nei cieli. Infondi in noi il tuo Spirito che soffia dove vuole, perché a tutti noi sia donata la parola della croce che ci rivela il pensiero di Cristo, che è sapienza e potenza di Dio. Accogliendo il carisma di San Paolo della Croce, di cui ti siamo grati, non vogliamo sapere e annunciare altro che il Cristo e il Cristo crocifisso, Redentore dell'uomo, Liberatore del mondo, nella certezza che nella memoria viva della passione di Cristo sta il rimedio di tutti i mali, per la salvezza dell'uomo e per l'unità in Dio del mondo plurale, per Cristo nostro Signore. Amen. O Maria, Madre del Verbo crocifisso, Regina dei martiri, ti invochiamo con le parole della tenerezza filiale di San Paolo della Croce. Volgi il tuo sguardo di salvezza sul mondo intero, nel quale i tuoi figli combattono con te contro il drago, e rendi vittoriosi della vittoria della fede quanti nel mondo custodiscono i comandamenti di Dio per l'unità della verità nel mondo plurale, nella comunione delle differenze della società. Amen. Pace e bene a tutti e arrivederci a domani. Grazie per la vostra presenza. L'appuntamento per questa sera alle 20:30.